Hey, I am sitting here with Justin Preaus. Justin Preaus is an appraiser here in Northeast Louisiana. I've known Justin a number of years. We've actually done a lot of deals where we have sent the work his way. We have referred him to clients, and in my opinion, just a top-notch guy to do appraisal work for rural real estate. And typically the things that we've asked him to do have been larger tracts. Some tracts are several thousand acres, and I remember the smallest one was probably 200 odd acres, but it was pretty high-end tract on a lot of water frontage. But anyway, Justin's our go-to guy. He is has a degree in forestry from Louisiana Tech. He's been a licensed appraiser for 10 years. And we're just going to visit a little bit, primarily, Justin, kind of in the context of rural real estate, as you know.
Right.
So, because that's what most of the people that watch and listen, that's what they're interested in. And if you have any interest in getting a hold of Jason, you need some information, you want to talk to him about his services, his information will be in the contacts. Just feel free to reach out to him. I recommend him personally, so feel free to reach out to him and use him any way you need to. Justin, what I wanted to start with, just kind of ask you to just tell us just a little bit general overview of who you are and what you're doing, and then I'll get into a couple of specific questions about rural real estate.
Certainly. Again, my name is Justin Preaus. I'm an appraiser here in Monroe, and I've been licensed for 10 years or so now, and actually worked in an office with another appraiser, Michael Graham, who's been at it about 10 or 12 years longer than I have. And like Pat said, we're certified general appraisers, and we primarily appraise commercial real estate. It would be anything but residential stuff. But my favorite is the big land parcels, is the rural land, the recreational properties, agricultural stuff. Those are the things that I like to do. And of course, we do a little bit of everything. We do things from hotels to apartments to strip centers and subdivisions. It's always something different, but yeah, I've always enjoyed picking up the pieces, the deals that you've got going, and getting to go look at those and help out with those. And those are the buyers and participants I enjoy talking with too.
I got you. Well, listen, most people's either experience or any interaction they've ever had with real estate and appraisals has dealt with residential primarily. So, just in a nutshell, what's the difference primarily between doing residential appraisals and the commercial side of which you do?
Sure, and we get that a lot. And rarely will you find an appraiser that does both residential work and commercial work, simply because keeping up with all the data is just so time consuming for both.
Think about that.
Right, and residential appraisal is more of a high volume business. And to be fair, it's because they have a lot of data to work with. They have a lot of excellent data of 5 houses might sell in the same neighborhood, and they're very comparable, and they're able to extract adjustments and good comparisons. What stuff we do sometimes with commercial, it requires a lot larger scope. I like what you mentioned. We may have to branch out, and it may be more of a regional search, and we may be talking with a dozen different sources to get the data that we need.
Well, you're actually, the second question on my sheet right here was, how do you deal with lack of comps for rural real estate? Because I know, if I get you to appraise 2,200 acres in North Madison Parish there, with certain little characteristics, you can't run out there and just get 10 comps on that.
No, you can, and you run into issues that you don't always run into with residential properties. One of which is you have to identify what's your highest and best use of a tract. And with residential, you pretty much know what that's going to be.
Sure.
But with these rural tracts, sometimes we've run into parcels that were possibly suitable for maybe conversion to another use. Farmland, is it feasible to go out and level this and convert it back? Maybe it's expired CRP, something of that nature. And you start looking at what's it going to cost to do that. Is it feasible? So you run into a lot of, to do that, you actually have a lot of data sets. And what you're hitting on there is, well, even if you have a known property type, say it was 2,200 acres over in a certain area, there's not going to be 3 just like it that we can plug into a report. No, there's not. So what we wind up doing is we have a more in-depth search, and we may be getting regional comps from if it was in Madison, we might expand all the way over to, we might get Tensall, we might get West Carroll, we might get some Richland in there, and know the nuances of each location to where we can adjust for that. We also don't mind, because you simply have to, go back in time a little bit further. Most people that are familiar with a residential job, those comps are pretty fresh. They're usually within 6 months or so. In some areas, we're not opposed to going back several years because this is North Louisiana, and fortunately, our market conditions don't change rapidly. They change some.
That's a good point.
But something from last year is still very relevant. 2 years, 2 years ago is often very relevant. So we just have to. We have to also sometimes look for comparable sales and data that may not be exactly like ours, but is somewhat close. And then we start putting it all together, and what people sometimes don't realize is you may only see 4 sales that we maybe compare directly to the tract that you're looking at, but we may have pulled from 12 that we investigated to see if they were usable or not, to whittle it down to those 4 best ones. And the data provided by the other 8 that we didn't use is insightful too. It lets us know maybe what is the bottom, what is the floor for that market. This tract is better than these other 3 down here, so I know that's my floor.
Yeah.
But it's maybe not as good as these other 2 that I pulled over here. So that's my ceiling. And so you're able to bracket things to a certain extent, and that helps you zone in on those few comps that are the best.
Well, this isn't one of my questions, but it's something that when you said that, I've said probably 1,000 times to people, dealing with buyers and sellers in land. We're talking about appraisals that, hey, it is not, because everybody always wants to know, what's it going to appraise for?
Right.
And I tell people, you correct me if I'm wrong, that it is not so much, it's as much art as it is science. That, there is specific data that you use, but there's also that being able to manage the data and kind of come to put it all in the pot and do whatever it is you do in your brain, art-wise, to go, but here's the number for this track.
Correct, and that's where experience comes in, and you can't really buy that. And the gold standard for appraisals is always what's called quantitative reasoning, which is, again, I have 2 buildings and one of them has this feature, the other one doesn't, and I'm able to, well, this one sold for this and this one sold for this plus some, so that plus some must be what that extra parking lot is worth, or whatever it might be. And you're able to extract a real number from that, and paired sales analysis is what they call it. But paired sales analysis.
Okay.
And so you're able to get the mathematical correlation there.
So you can put a value on some of these little extra pieces.
Correct, and that's what a lot of residential guys do. They have such and such for a swimming pool, such and such for a second fireplace, things of that nature.
Yeah.
But what we're doing, like you said, there's not going to be so many of them that are just alike to be able to do that. So we're using what's called qualitative analysis a lot of times, where we know this is better than this. How much better? Well, I have these 3 or 4 sales over here that are indicating to me that it's in this percentage range for that. And it's not, again, you can back it up with proof, but it's not as succinct and clear as mathematical methods. But you're right, and that's what you have to do when you start looking at it. It is somewhat of an art form, I guess, as you put it, of knowing what is better, what is worse. That sort of thing.
Well, I know I've gotten bills for appraisals. I go, son of a gun, man, I can't believe it's that much.
Right.
But from what you're telling me, I can, I'm just starting to justify some of these numbers.
Right.
So.
And people always call and they ask and they say, well, how much is an appraisal? And I tell them, well, it really boils down to time. It really boils down to the legwork that we have to do to arrive at reasonable and supportable conclusions that are justifiable. And sometimes, and I hate to see it, the worst ones that we hate to hear because it's tough to tell people is when they maybe have a really small tract that maybe it does not have a tremendous value, but it's difficult and there's not much data for it. Well, it's hard to tell them that you've got to charge a pretty significant fee to go out there and value this thing.
Yeah.
And 14 acres, versus 140 or 400, well, it starts to make more financial sense to get the appraisal done when it's a little bit larger tract. So you run into that sometimes.
Same amount of work, whether it's 14 or 1400.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then that's sometimes the problem in rural areas is it's the same amount of work no matter how big the tract is.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've had some experience with some of the deals you've done for us where timber was involved. And of course you have, forestry background. How do you, in general, how do you account for timber with short of actually getting where we get an actual inventory of crews?
Okay.
When you're accounting for the timber, how do you do it?
When I'm accounting for it, you have to look at, it all boils down to in any valuation as to how does your market look at it. In different areas, the market looks at it in different ways. I've looked at some timber in some locations where when you start looking at, well, if we did decide to cut this tract, or somebody did, how far do they have to haul it? Is there even a market for it over here in the Flatwoods area of certain parishes? Union Parish, Washita Parish, Lincoln Parish, those are some timber producing areas. But sometimes you go east of there, there's not as much activity. And so, first of all, you have to look at, was there even a market for this stuff if we decide to do anything with it? And how does that impact it? And then, secondly, we start looking at, well, what is the quality of what's out there? And is it what we call merchantable? There's a difference.
That's the forestry in you. The average guy, like I say, most people don't even consider markets when they talk about their timber value. That's the the forester in you, which is good. I mean, that's the detail that's important.
And sometimes it's hard to tell somebody that they've got a lot of stems on the ground in a certain tract, and it looks pretty when you walk up there, and there's squirrels and there's this and there's that, and it's a great wildlife habitat. But if you tell them, well, we may have to take this stuff 120 miles to somebody that can use it, and it turns out that 2/3 of it really has got a lot of it's knotty and got a lot of holes in it, and it's great for your wildlife, but when it comes down to it, maybe there's not enough to necessitate doing anything with. Maybe you're better off leaving here. And you and I have talked in the past about some tracts that did have some decent timber on them, and a term that I keep coming back to is what we call excess timber. Is there excess timber? Excess timber being that timber that you could sever from that tract and realize profit from without damaging the integrity of the tract as a whole, specifically if it's a recreational type tract and you need those hardwood species there to facilitate the uses that you're used to.
Yeah.
You can go in there and thin and maybe take part of it off and leave what would still be considered a wooded stand by the players in the market. If you're going to just go hunt on it, you don't mind if it's $250 an acre out there or $500 an acre out there. The hunting's the same. But somebody might like to realize that $250 margin if they're looking at coming out of their own pocket to buy a tract. And it seems like in talking to different buyers and sellers and other brokers over the years that when you start looking at a wooded tract, and you're going to call it wooded, and you're going to look at those different attributes of it. Somewhere in the $200 to $400 an acre range really needs to be left, in my opinion, to have that. And if you're looking at excess timber, it's generally something above that.
I gotcha.
You go out to $1,000 an acre nice stand, well, and all of your other comparable sales, they're wooded, but they're lightly wooded, and it's not great stuff. Well, you might have a margin of $500-600 an acre that you could take off of that tract and realize in your pocket after you buy it, and still have something comparable to those other four properties that we're talking about.
You've talked about excess timber before, and that's I have a better. I always generally understood what you meant, but that's a real clear picture of it there, and that's where a guy. Hey, and I'm not just trying to pump up Justin here, but it's just he's adding a lot of value here. That's where a guy like you can, because you're eyeballing that. You're not doing an inventory. And so that the forestry background in you, been able to look at the density and stuff in species and realize, gosh, there's about 2 loads to the acre on here, and about $30 a ton. Da da da. Yeah, I mean you're doing the data on the fly.
Correct, and my father, Mark Preaus, he's still a very active forester, and I'll sometimes take photos, aerials, things of that nature, and discuss some of these tracts with him just to get another set of eyes on it.
Yeah.
And I'm over here and say this part of Franklin Parish, and this tract looks like this, and what are the options here for a landowner? Well, it may or may not be feasible. He may be better off leaving all that and just enjoying it for what it is, that sort of thing. And I have to tell landowners all the time, I dealt with one the other day just north of Waverly. I said, let me get out there and get my eyes on it before I tell you if we're going to need to hire a forester or not. And went out there and looked, and it was mixed age stuff, and the patches of pine that he did have, they weren't enough for a logger to fool with.
Yeah.
And I had to explain that to him. Yes, you have a patch here that's 12 acres of planted pine that needs to be thinned, but I don't know if you're going to get a logger to drive over to Waverly to get 12,
all the way to graphic to yeah.
Correct. And so I said it needs to be thinned to preserve, and it needs to be released from the other trees around it to grow. But I'm not going to give it a whole lot in this appraisal, and he understood that.
Yeah.
That your product is only as good as your marketed buyers, and that's what you run into sometimes with that. But every case is different.
Well, let me take this whole thing about excess timber one step further, because like I say, you've got kind of piqued my curiosity a little bit. Let's just say that it is that it's just a quality standard. We're somewhere where we're dealing with grade hardwood,
Okay.
and we realize there's substantial volume. I mean, it's real value out there, and you get an inventory from a forester. Okay, and it comes into whatever it is. Do you then just basically take that at face value, minus $200 to $400 an acre, what you consider to remain a wooded tract, and then that extra value goes on top of your number?
Typically, it does. That's the way I generally look at it. And again, it boils down to if the sales that I compare it to are wooded, and I know what their levels are. If they're $200 to $400 an acre, then yes, I'm gonna look at this inventory, and I'm gonna allot 200 to 400 acres for my subject tract. Anything above that is gravy on top, more or less. But if I'm looking at, say, a bunch of cutover land tracts, well then I would, again, comparing that to my subject, well, all of it is gravy on top compared to a cutover. In which case, I would make sure that I mentioned in the report how I'm looking at it. That's the main thing. If you disclose how you're doing it, everybody's on the same page.
Yeah.
And you can see, well, what's the timber worth? Because there's some markets where, especially when you start getting into some pine growing areas, well, pine growing areas, cutovers are a fact of life. It's just, you see that all the time. But you get over in some really good hardwood areas, you don't see as many cutovers because it takes so long for it to regenerate. So oftentimes you'll see a lot of thinnings and things of that nature. But in the pine growing uplands, people used to deal with cutover numbers too.
Yeah, it's part of the cycle.
It is. And so whenever I start looking at stuff over in the central part of the state, a lot of your land comps are going to be for cutover, but you don't see that much of it, say, over in the eastern part of the state, because they don't have to wait, unless they're about maybe to convert it into some type of program, and they may be going to enroll it or something of that nature. Then you might see some things, some things change, but most of the time people don't want to take that kind of land over there to the bare dirt.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah.
If they're wanting to hunt on it and recreate on it, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Well, just let me ask this last question. It'd be a good way to kind of sum it up, especially since we've been talking about rural real estate. What do you think, in your opinion, are the biggest, or the one or two biggest misunderstandings or misconceptions that people have with appraisal work?
Right. Because like you mentioned, a lot of times people are only familiar with what they already know, which is sometimes the residential end. Yeah. I'd say that one thing I like to tell people is it's not an exact science. It's you might get 3 different appraisers and they might have 3 different numbers. Hopefully they're all somewhat close and they're all backed up to a similar degree with good information. But we operate in a range of reasonable value. Oftentimes on property, especially larger recreational tracts, farmland, things of that nature, I like to put in my report a point value, because a lender always is going to want and need a point value. But I'll put that range in there of I might be concluding at $2,200 an acre for this tract, but it might be $2,100 to $2,300 an acre might be a reasonable range for this thing of 10% range. Because none of us are that precise.
Sure.
And to be honest, sometimes people will say, well, the last couple of times I saw so-and-so have an appraisal, well, the number of the appraisal came in at the number that the contract was on. How does that happen? Well, we look at that as, is it a willing buyer and a willing seller, and are they both market savvy? Do they know what they're doing? And if that number is in the reasonable range, well, why on earth would we undercut it by 2 or 3% and peg our number that we're looking at and mess up a deal when that number is entirely feasible.
Let me interrupt you, but there are guys, people that will sit in the chair opposite on the other side of the table and do exactly that. And that's a gripe that I have, is that they're so sure of their number that they take an arm's length deal with market forces, knowing buyer, knowing seller, and a contract price. And no, that number's not right. This number's right, and burns my biscuits.
And I can see it when it's a sizable margin between the two. You know, when it's substantially tough to prove and tough to back it up. That happens. We hate to do that, but that does happen. And sometimes I'll say this: sometimes we have saved some people on making some bad deals, saved some lending institutions too, and they later come back and realize that we saved them. But at the time, they didn't like the fact that the deal didn't work.
Yeah.
But that's also what we're here, is to prevent people from making mistakes. I love doing appraisals for people that maybe are looking to, I'm thinking about selling this property, and you go out and appraise it, and I was going to ask substantially less than this. I had no idea. Well, you might have saved them a lot.
Yeah, that's a good feeling. Yeah.
And something else that I mentioned along those lines that's a misconception that people sometimes don't consider is we have to consider all these different pertinent bits of information, and yes, a group of sales data is what we've got to have to value a tract, but the market is the ultimate appraiser, and sometimes we'll run across a piece of property that's, say, been exposed to the market by somebody like you that's been out there advertising, promoting it or whatnot, and it's been exposed at a certain level, and we then know, well, maybe it's what it's not worth, if that makes sense. We've actually had people sometimes, I'm looking at this property and I think it's $250,000 and I'm willing to pay for this. Well, it turns out that somebody's had it on the market a year ago for 9 months at 200 and it didn't sell. Well, we have to take that into account.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? So sometimes the history of a property is important as well as what the sales are indicating too. I'm not saying that doesn't all jive together.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But you do have to look at that sort of thing.
And markets are trending up and trending down, and you're looking at historical data
Right.
in a going forward scenario.
Right.
If I said it right, you know what I'm saying?
You did. I quickly tell you, we had one happen that was kind of amusing to us, and it was an instance of, I guess people don't, they do have some misconceptions about what it is we do. And it was a fellow looking to donate a piece of timberland, and he thought it was worth about $300,000, and we were talking to him about it, and we were getting some information about it, and he said, well, so-and-so has all the maps and information on it. And it was a brokerage firm, and we said, did you have it listed? Well, yeah, I had it listed all last year and we said, what was it for? Well, $200,000. And we said, so you think it's going to appraise for $300,000 even though it's been advertised? Well, yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't. It never clicked in his head that the market and people going out there, and those dozen people that came and looked at that property, they make up the market.
They voted.
The appraiser is putting a number on a piece of paper, and it's his opinion.
Yeah.
But we're not. The market is the best teller of value, in my opinion. Other than that, something I run across, and people probably are glad to hear this. What matters most when we go out and look at a tract is the bones, so to speak, of that piece of property. It's not the little minutiae details. It's not people fretting about the fact that that we haven't been up there and the camp is a mess, and we haven't been there since hunting season, and we haven't bush hogged all the lanes, and we haven't done all these things. That's really not what we're looking at. That's rest easy that we see it for what it can be, and that sort of thing. Another item that I would like to touch on is the fact that, and it's a misconception, I think people know it, not everything that you do, and I know you're intimately familiar with this topic, not everything that you do to a piece of property, cost-wise, is going to correlate to an increment of value equal to that cost.
It's just like somebody putting a swimming pool in on a home.
Exactly.
An example of
And
what's
there are things that will correlate to value, and there are things that partly will. The classic example of something that is feasible from a cost standpoint is, say you own a tract that doesn't come out to road frontage and you have to go across somebody else, and you're able to buy a little piece one day that's 3 acres that will now connect you to the road and give you your whole tract utilities. Well, that's a no-brainer. That cost of adding that property is gonna increase the value of the other part of the property. It's what's called a plottage value. But there are things that people sometimes will do that they need to know may not, just like you said, the swimming pool. I've seen some really, really intensively developed tracts, sometimes some rural tracts that we just couldn't put the number on those items that they put in them because it was a labor of love for them and it was a romance and that sort of thing. And that
It's hard to put a value on pretty, huh?
It is, and sometimes people have built some really elaborate, nice camp houses and things on big tracts, and they know going in that it's on a dirt road and it's probably not going to bring what it would bring in town for the house, things of that nature. But people should know about that. I'd say that again, the biggest issue I think is that we're operating and it's not an exact science. It is an estimate in our opinion, and talk to your appraiser. Don't be afraid to do that. If you have some good information and that you feel is relevant, share it with your appraiser. If you know of some sales that have taken place locally, I might be operating in 12 different parishes this year. I can't keep up with everything. I try to keep up with what's pertinent and what I'm going to need, but we may miss some things. So if you know some things that you think are comparable, by all means let us know about it. It might help us out. It might get you a more accurate estimation, evaluation. I've actually had appraisals come back after I turned them in, and somebody calls up and say, "Hey, did you not consider this sale?" Well, when did it happen? Well, it happened while you were performing your appraisal. I already done my data search, and it turned out that it actually made a difference, and we were happy to put it in. So, we're always game to hear what people have to say, what people might suggest, but also on the flip side of that, people shouldn't get offended if perhaps their information is not utilized. It might not be that comparable after all. But that's for us to determine, and we'll do the best we can.
Yeah, well, you rely on data, but it's your knowledge to put it all together.
Right.
So,
and at the end of the day, we say, regardless of where we come out, it is what it is. We need to be objective. We need to be advocates for our job, our value. We're not advocates for a buyer or a seller. We need to be advocates for our own opinion of value for that property.
all right, well, that's a good way of saying it. Well, Justin, but I'm not going to keep you any longer. Some great information, folks. Again, just check his information out at the bottom if you want to reach out to him and use him in any way. Personally recommend him. A lot of our investors have used him, clients have used him. So anyway, he'll do a good job for you. Justin, thank you, buddy.
Hey, I appreciate you.
Appreciate you.